Who would benefit from this information would be special education directors, teachers, related service providers, school nurses, and your Medicaid billing staff. Currently, there are no supporting documents for this module. This module is designed to provide an overview of billing and documentation requirements for school-based Medicaid. Each of these modules are set up in the same format to be used by districts to train their staff on school-based Medicaid services with a PowerPoint presentation, speaker notes, and supporting documents. The first slide of this presentation identified who would benefit from this information.
Parental consent. Consents to provide medical services. As required under federal and state education laws, school-based Medicaid providers are required to obtain parental permission to provide the special education and related services defined in a child IEP. Consent to request reimbursement from Idaho Medicaid requires an annual parental consent to provide the child medically necessary services, and in order for school-based Medicaid providers to submit claims to Idaho Medicaid. At any time, a parent may withdraw consent in writing. The provider cannot submit claims to Idaho Medicaid. We would have you reference Form 560, which is on the State Department of Education Special Education website, which is the authorization for disclosure of identifying education record information for school-based Medicaid reimbursement. Again, this is a copy of that Form 560, and it can be found on the State Department of Education website under Programs, Special Ed, and the Special Ed Forms.
And to address again, there is proposed rules on a federal level to only have this required once, but currently it is required annually for districts to continue to bill school-based Medicaid services. When or if that proposed federal regulation to require only one consent until withdrawn in writing is approved and adopted, I will send notification out to districts on that change.
Specific documentation is required for all Medicaid billable services. Documentation requirements can vary based on the service that's being delivered. Be sure that district staff billing for school-based Medicaid services are familiar with the required documentation for that service.
Specific documentation includes the student's first and last name, the name and title of the person that's delivering the service. This field should be specific to whether the teacher, the parent, or a professional would deliver that service for that particular day. If the parent changes throughout the day or every other day or whenever there's a change, that person needs to be noted on that specific record. I want to clarify, we're currently talking about your daily service reports, your specific documentation on what happens throughout that student's name. So if a student, Joe, is receiving a behavioral intervention from Pam, and then it is taken over by Jerry, it needs to note when that change took place of the person changing. In addition, the location of that service, excuse me, if it's outside of a school.
Medicaid also needs the first and last name, the first and last legal name of the student. I know quite often we'll have students who go by a shortened version or a nickname of their name. So for example, if you had a student whose name was Robert Jones, but he goes by Bob, on the Medicaid forms, the daily service record, actually any Medicaid form, their preference is that you are documenting the student's legal name for Medicaid purposes.
The category of service, this should be specific to the service that is identified on the student's IEP. So for example, if you on the IEP have called this intensive behavioral intervention, it needs to on the service on the daily specific documentation say intensive behavioral intervention. If it says behavioral consultation, OT, SLP, or PCS, again, it needs to be reflective of what you wrote on that IEP. That category of service needs to translate to that daily service report. Caution. This is a big caution. Only one Medicaid billable service can be billed at one time. So for an example, if a paraprofessional is supporting a student under behavioral intervention and the student meets with the SLP, during that time, only the SLP or the para can be billing. They need to choose who's going to be billing for that service at that time. It cannot be both supporting the student. Excuse me. Student is in the classroom being supported by a behavioral interventionist and the behavioral consultant comes in. It needs to be determined who's going to be billing. Is it going to be the para delivering the intervention or the behavioral consultant who's doing an observation and potential training for that student?
Additional specific documentation requirements are that whether the service was being provided in a group or individual setting. This is critical when you are billing a service that can be billed at differing rates based on whether it is an individual service or a group service. So it is very important to document whether the service was being provided as individual or group. And services also need to be listed on the IEP. So again, your daily service report needs to reflect not only, again, as Shannon indicated, the category of the service, so whether it is PCS or developmental therapy, which is allowable at this point in time, but the specific service that is being provided. So your options here are to either restate the goal that you're addressing for that particular service. So for example, student interrupts class. Or you can reference the goal by a numeric system. If your goals are numbered or on your IEP, you can just reference goal number 1, goal number 3, or whatever it would directly relate back to. Or you could reference the IEP goal, again, making it clear which objective is being addressed. You also need to document the date, time, and duration of services. So in the example here, we've given you the date, the beginning time that the service started, and then the ending time. And then the duration would be the total amount of time that the service was provided, in this case 2 hours. Specific documentation also needs to include the student's progress or response to each service delivered. Again, quite often districts are documenting student response by collecting data. So for example, if the goal is for the student to increase the frequency of raising their hand as opposed to blurting out, then you would document their response would be that they raised their hand a certain number of times within that data collection or data sampling period. If the services that you're going to assist the student in toileting, then it would be documenting the number of times that the student was taken to the bathroom. So again, your possible ways that you can document the student's response or progress, again, is just, again, that number of prompts given or the number of times that they were redirected. Whatever your goal would be, and your data collection would be a way to document student progress or response. Specific documentation also needs to include progress that should be reported at least every 120 days, which could coincide with your district's quarterly progress reports.
Each Medicaid billing service has a unique billing code with specific billing units. During school-based Medicaid audits, documentation was required to reflect back on any service that was billed that they billed the correct amount of units. So your district needs to make sure that their billing the correct code with the correct units and have documentation to back up what that billing covers. Again, that documentation is, was the student in attendance that day? Make sure that you're not pre-populating forms that would reflect when school wasn't in session or the student wasn't in school, and making sure that those records are kept for 6 years. Another thing on the billing units, most evaluations are considered a one billable unit for that complete evaluation. However, PCS and behavioral intervention could be billed in a 15-minute unit. So you would need to be familiar with what rate or billing unit goes with what specific codes. School districts and charters that enroll as Medicaid providers can receive reimbursement for school-based Medicaid services for students who are eligible for Medicaid. Each service must be specifically identified on the student's IEP. Services must be medically necessary for the child to benefit from their educational program. Parents, guardians must be notified that the school district, charter, or infant toddler program intends to bill Medicaid for that student's services. The Idaho Training Clearinghouse will be the central place where people can find information, districts can find information in regard to school-based Medicaid training, archived webinars. School-based Medicaid will have its own specific learning community where frequently asked questions are posted, and archived webinars.
This concludes this module. This concludes this module on billing and documentation. We have had a couple of questions